everyone. Welcome to the Office of Indian Education Professional Development Program Talking Circle for September. Welcome, welcome. Before we get started, let's go ahead and listen to our disclaimer. If it'll play. Oh, well, I guess it's not going to work today, so I'll read it. This presentation was produced under U.S. Department of Education, contract number GS00F115CA with Synergy Enterprises Incorporated. The views expressed herein do not necessarily represent the positions or policies of the U.S. Department of Education. No official endorsement by the U.S. Department of Education of any product, commodity, service, or enterprise mentioned herein is intended or should be inferred. All right, now that we've got that done, let's go ahead. There's some few more people waiting in the waiting room. More joining. Again, aloha, I am Olani Lily. I am your OIETA team coach. Also on is Sarah Brightwell. She's our OIETA team lead. And then, of course, joining us is your program officer, Angela Hernandez. Let's go ahead and look at what's on the agenda today. So today we're really going to be talking about fiscal basics, breaking down your budget, as well as some assistance around developing your budget revision as the new grant year begins. And then at the end, we'll have time for some question and answer. And let's move into the fiscal basics. I will turn this over to Angela.
Thanks, Alani.
Mhm.
As we go through the presentation today, everybody, I'm sure as we kind of ramp up and you have some time to be in it, questions are going to come up. I'm going to ask you to make sure you're putting any and all questions in the chat. We'll certainly get to as many as we can. But just as a heads up, my expectation is that assuming we don't get to all of them today, I am going to capture those so that we can resume and provide any additional guidance by the next talking circle, if not sooner, post this. So just be aware. I want to make sure we do get to all questions, and I am hoping to hit on various topics and issues that have been raised during my many conversations with a number of you over the last few weeks. So that I think will be relevant to more than just a couple of people. So again, thanks for taking the time this afternoon, everybody. Why are we talking about this? Well, I want to just kind of start out with the basics, right? So all that we're going to talk about today has a foundation grounded in the uniform guidance, that 2 CFR Part 200, EDGAR, which is our department-wide regulations, and that's where you find really how to administer a grant, right? And how you manage the grants. Much broader and applicable to all discretionary grants. Then we have our program regulations, 34 CFR 263. And I'll ask Olani and others to just throw those at their leisure, those URLs in the chat. But the 34 CFR 263 is really important because those regulations that you see there today in real time in ecfr.gov are applicable to both of the cohorts that are joining us today, 18 and 21. So those are the updated, finalized regs, and they are applicable to everybody. Now that covers everything from, what the priorities for the program are to how people are supposed to be reporting service payback and all of the requirements and parameters around that. It also has, of course, prescriptive guidance on what are allowable costs. So you see a lot of that language pop up again in the notice inviting applications for your respective cohorts about specifically the allowable training costs, which are as expansive if you look at the language, very expansive, and a lot of things can be included under that. what I know I get a lot of questions about is, well, it doesn't talk about the stipends. The stipend amounts and those maximum amounts that we reference often are actually noted in the notice inviting applications for your respective cohorts. For 18 and 21, it's the same. It's the same dollar amount. There are no changes. So just to be aware of that. But that's where you find that information. Next slide. So again, general considerations, it's that, you know, reasonable, allocable, and allowable. We're talking about reasonable and necessary. I'm happy to say I've never run into an issue. I shouldn't use the word never, but I haven't. When people are asking for things and asking about allowable costs, we've never really had to cut because something doesn't look allowable. Allocable can be something that trips you up. And that really happens more when we get to training costs, meaning as you get into implementation and as, you know, training costs by individual starts to fluctuate and not be consistent for lots of different reasons, that allocability I know can pose a challenge sometimes for folks. Adequately documented. I'll get into this, I think, over the next few months here and there, and you're going to hear me talk about it in the context probably more of induction services and the types of supports that you might be providing to people using direct cost funds, and making sure that you're accounting for any support that you're providing directly to your participants who've completed, right? But you're still providing support, as an example, travel, and we'll come back to that in a bit. And then again, consistent with grantee rules that apply about federally funded and non-federally funded activities. And I'll leave it at that. Next slide, please. So again, prudent, it's part of the market prices, meaning I expect in remote areas, things may be far more expensive for lots of different reasons than in places where there are a lot more resources available and there's more of a competitive market. It's consistent with your policies. And so reasonable and necessary, again, in the context of training costs, I always come back to the word equity. So whatever you're planning to do for one participant, you must be planning and have the funds to do for all participants. And that's really key. And it gets, I know, a little challenging at times because you don't always know the final number you're working with, and that fluctuates. But to protect yourselves, having written policies around how you will support your participants and ensure equity is key. Next slide. So the allocable means a good or service that can be assigned, right? So if a cost benefits two or more projects or activities, you're determining the proportion. And the example we give here is a laptop, right? Where I'll just say for folks, many of you who have both an FY18 grantee and an FY21 grantee, if you are purchasing a laptop and it's going to be used for both, it should be 50-50, right? Kind of short answer. But where that can also, where you might run into this might be where you're offering activities or sessions or workshops or services, let's say to, you know, participants, if you happen to have two grants within the same cohort, or it happens to be a type of activity where you might have two grants from two different years that is able to support both people from both. So that's what we mean by the allocability, is make sure that you're pulling the right numbers, the right amount, the right prices for each cohort from those respective pots, and not, for example, paying for something for FY18 grantees using your 21 grant funds. Okay. Next slide. We have lots of stuff online as far as training resources. And if you are a newer project director, I strongly encourage you to look particularly at the Ed training resource. It's a little more straightforward and gives you some of the basics. but really critical because those were fundamental changes made to the expectation and frankly, a greater accountability accorded to grantees with uniform guidance over past financial principles. Next slide, please. So a couple of things. Yes, I'm going to always go to the project director on record with the grant for any questions. It doesn't mean that you are the one that has to have the answer, but the expectation or assumption is you're working with whoever you need to get the right answer. It's really critical that you communicate with me, your program officer, about any possible changes, emergent changes, and many of you have been great about doing that. So I really do appreciate that. It matters and it makes a difference, and we often head off any issues far ahead of any potential problems. Again, monitoring and adjusting budgets as you need. This tends to be a time where there's a lot of fluctuation for lots of different reasons. I think the due dates that I've given you guys for revised budgets seem appropriate, but if for some reason it's too soon, it happens to be too soon for your budget office and the cycles in which they do work, and you need more time, just email me and let me know that you're going to need more time. I'm not trying to hold hard and fast, but I want to make sure that you really do have a plan to carry out the rest of the year's activities. And that's really the focus of this budget. Next slide, please. So we always encourage project directors to request G5 view only access. And these days, they still require you to fill out this crazy form. It's not terrible, but you can download it from G5, and it's the G5 payee access form. There's an FAQ that points you and has a link for it. And once you complete it, and particularly under number 4, there are these boxes there that you might be able to see, I don't know, that say view only. And that's really all you're trying to check, is to view, to have the ability to view your budget. And then you email that document and any other related notarized documents to the email that Olani, thank you, Olani, just posted there in the chat. Okay. And if for some reason you miss this, again, it's an FAQ in the G5 system on the homepage. With that, Sarah, I think I turn it over to you.
That's me. All right, so we're going to jump into the really fun part of all the nuts and bolts of how you'll actually complete your budget revision. I know some of you have done many budget revisions, and for others, this may be your first budget revision season. But I promise I have fun things for both of you, because we've updated the form a bit with some new tips and tricks that I hope will actually make the process even easier for everybody. So if we can go to the next slide, we're going to touch on what are the things that if you put them in your budget revision, they need prior approval, versus what are the things where you don't actually have to send in a brand new budget revision. Now, this first one, everybody has to do, but if later in the year, there are things that are listed in 2 CFR 200.308 and .407, which you have the links to, any of those items do need prior approval, which means you would want to reach out to Angela and complete a budget revision for those items, as well as if you're going to make any changes to your training costs. Then think about key personnel. So if your project director is changing, or if the percentage of time that you as project director are spending on the project is changing, if you're going from a full-time allocation to maybe now you're going to spend half your time on this and you're going to spend half your time on another project. Those types of things do require approval and a budget revision. Changes from direct to contracting of services. So this might be, maybe you weren't able to hire for a position under personnel, and so now you're going to actually contract out that position. That might be something that's happening, and that would require approval. Changes to travel, and we're going to talk a bit more about travel later. And then if you're moving training funds out of the training stipends category, Okay, so anything that's being moved out of that training stipends category. And then just in general, it's best to keep your budget up to date with OIE. So if you're making lots of changes, even if they don't require approval, if it's just kind of changing your budget a good bit, it's just good to go ahead and send in your updated budget so that Angela has the most up-to-date information for your project. All right, let's go to the next slide. So this is our optional budget revision tool. And I know we always get this question, well, if it's optional, do I have to use it? So I will say technically, no. You can provide all this same information in your own form. But I think some of our seasoned project directors could tell you it will be such a pain for you to come up with your own form that will include all of this same exact information. It's much easier just to go ahead and use the form that's already created that has all the info that's required and needed. So I would encourage you to go ahead and go that route. And I believe on the next slide, you'll see an example of what that would look like completed. Again, yours may look very different depending upon what you're doing in your project. This is just to kind of give you a quick look at what that could look like completed. But we're going to actually unshare this screen and I'm going to go live to the form because I want to show you how it works. What are some of the new features for those who have done this before? All right, so it is an Excel spreadsheet. For some of you, that might be a yay. For some of you, you may be thinking, oh no, I hate Excel. And that's okay. We're going to make it as user-friendly as possible. So we have 3 tabs in this spreadsheet. We have one that's the actual form that you're going to complete. That's where we are now, that budget revision form. Next to that, you'll find the budget revision directions tab. And all of this beautiful neon yellow is just showing you this is where you're going to type, because one of the common questions I get is, I can't type into column E. No, you can't. So the reason you can't type into column E is because that column auto-calculates. It takes the information you entered in column C and the information you entered in column D, adds it up to give you column E. So it's taking your current performance period budget and your carryover budget and adding it together because that's your actual full budget for the year. So it does that for you. The other thing it does for you is it auto calculates column G. So that's another column that if you're thinking, man, I just can't type in there. Nope. And that is because it's going to take your existing budget. It's going to take any of those changes. So you'll see you can type there. So you'll type in your changes there and it will auto calculate your new budget. The other place you can't type that I get questions about is you'll see the row for personnel or the row for fringe isn't neon yellow. The reason for that is, again, you can't type there because there is a formula. So anywhere that there is a formula, it's protected so that you don't type over the formula. Because one of the joys of the spreadsheet for Angela is that if you use this form, it auto calculates these things and she can trust the numbers. She can trust the totals. If you type over those formulas, then she has to check your math. And that adds a lot of time into how long it's going to take her to look at your budgets and give you approvals. And I know you want your budget approvals back quickly. The other nice thing is that you can trust the math. And if your total existing budget and your total revised budget don't match, it'll turn red and give you a heads up that something is amiss, something is awry, because those should match. Okay. So those rows for each of your categories auto-calculate because you're going to put your line item expenditures into the neon yellow areas, and then it will auto-calculate your category totals. All right, let me show you the rest of this, and then we'll do a little practice. And then your last tab here is your budget revision example. Again, this is just an example. You don't have to have the same expenditures that are in this example. It was just to kind of show you what it could look like completed. And so you'll see one thing in particular to note is that anywhere that there was a budget change, so there was something in this column F, you'll note that there is accompanying narrative in column H. If you're adding money to or taking money away in any area, you want to make sure that you've got narrative there explaining why. Totally fine. That's the whole point of a budget revision, is to move things like that. But you want to make sure that you do have that accompanying narrative. So you'll note in the example that that's something that has occurred. All right, so I want to go over to the actual form and show you a few tips and tricks there. So one tip and trick is anywhere that you see this little blue caret, and depending upon your version of Excel, it might be orange or another color. Sometimes it's kind of a salmon color, but if it has a little caret in the corner, there's a tip there. And so we've tried to pop in some tips. So for instance, current performance period budget. For fiscal year 18 grantees, that's October 1st, 2022 to September 30th, 2023. And you're in year 5. And for our fiscal year 21 grantees, your year is August 3rd, 2022 to August 2nd, 2023, and you're in year 2. So just little reminders like that. You'll see the carryover. It's reminding you that that's anything you've carried over from years 1 through 4 if you're an 18, or from year 1 if you're a 21. Little reminders that this is an auto calculation. So we've popped those in just to try to be helpful in that way. Next up, I want to show you how to add a row, because I will say this is probably my most common question I get about the form over in the OIE email account is, I can't add a row. You can. So here is my great suggestion for you. Depending upon your version of Excel, you may have things that work easier than others. But I promise no matter what version you're working in, it will work better in adding a row if you come to the second expenditure in the category. So for personnel, don't go to row 12, the first expenditure. Go to row 13, the second expenditure, that bottom expenditure. Highlight that row. Then when you right click, or however you choose to bring up your menu, to hit insert, it'll bring up a warning sometimes, but it adds that row. Okay, it adds that row, and you'll notice now if I put dollar amounts into each of these, it's still auto calculating up to my total there. Okay, so it's still playing into that formula. So we'll try it again. Like with travel, don't use row 19 because that's your first one. Use row 20, your second one. And it's always going to add it a lot easier that way. So that's my adding a row tip. Like I said, for some of you, your version of Excel will work totally fine if you went with that top row. But for other versions of Excel, it gets very angry about using the top row. And so it's just easier to always make sure and use that bottom expenditure and save yourself the angst of it possibly not working right for you. So that's one piece. And then let's say, let me give us some better salaries than $5. And then we have a little carryover here, we popped in. But let's say that we're getting a raise this year, so we need to increase this salary by $10,000. You just pop $10,000 in there, you'll see that salary has now increased to $90,000. Great. But what if we hired someone and based on the salary schedule in our university, they actually are being hired in at a slightly lower rate than the previous project director? So what if we actually need to lower this salary by $5,000? Just put a negative 5,000, and that's how you take away from one of the categories or one of the lines there. So if you just put in a basic number, it will add it. If you put in a negative, it will take it away. So that's how you're going to make your budget changes there. And then, of course, putting in our great narrative. Remember, the better the narrative, the better your explanation. Again, the easier it is for Angela to just review your budget revision, approve it, and move on, versus her having to come back and ask you, but why did you do that? Why are you making that change? So more narrative, better. And I'll get this question. Do I only have this amount of space? No, you can keep typing all this great explanation. And then I know sometimes you'll say, well, but now I can't see it. If you go to that line in between, for instance, here 12 and 13, and just double click, expands it out. Okay, so that's how you can make it a little bigger, but you can type to your heart's content in that narrative box and it can take it. Now, here's my final kind of tip on that. Some folks will send in their budget revision as a PDF. So instead of sending it as the Excel spreadsheet, they then PDF it. Don't do that. I understand why, because we all love PDFs, but when you do that, it often shrinks your narrative boxes back to one row and then PDFs it that way. And we have no way to then expand it back to see your great explanation. So highly encourage you, please just send it as the Excel document the same way that the form is created, because when you PDF it, like I said, it sometimes covers up some of that great info. And then you run into the same dilemma where Angela's going to have to email you back and ask for it. You'll notice all of this info down here. And see now, because I've made these changes, my actual budget for the year doesn't match with my new budget. So it's in red. So it's a great way to give you a heads up that, oopsie, I've got to make some other changes, because right now I need to put that $5,000 that I took away from personnel somewhere. So it's just putting in some checks and balances there to try to help make this a little bit easier. And then the final thing I'll show you is up here. You'll just want to make sure and put your grantee name, your PR number, and your name with my great typing there. So you'll want to put in that info because, again, sometimes y'all have really creative ways of naming these spreadsheets, which is fine. But then once she opens it up, it can be, you know, the headache of which grantee am I trying to look at? Make sure your info's at the top so it's nice and easy for us to review and know whose budget this is. So now questions. Feel free to unmute. If you're not in a spot where you can unmute and ask a question, feel free to pop it in the chat. But what questions do you have on the form? As you're thinking about that and possibly putting some over in the chat, just remember that once you leave here and you're actually trying to put your own budget into this form, sometimes questions pop up. That is okay. Feel free to reach out. I'll put, again, our TA team email address in here. We try to respond to those as quickly as possible, but typically always within 24 hours. So, you know, email us, let us know you have a question, as well as we're always happy to hop on a Zoom. You know, we'll have folks who want to kind of walk through their budgets. Happy to do that. We're here to help. So don't feel like, oh, you know, once I leave here, I'm stuck. I just have to make this work. No, reach out. Often those questions don't pop up until you're trying to do it yourself.
Sarah,
Yeah.
I agree, Kelly. I think your walkthrough has been really, really helpful, and I think helps provide a lot of clarity where I know some folks felt a little bit challenged before. One thing I'll say is, in case folks are still kind of thinking or formulating any questions, is I also look at this chart and the way you've divided it, that the tan color column, set of columns, if you will, the existing grant budget, to me that's the money and that's the snapshot in time of your current balance, your carryover, and the total existing budget on the first day of this current budget period. So snapshot in time. And the requested revised budget is, okay, a few weeks later, okay, now I know what I got and I've got to make some changes. And that's your fluctuation. And that's your changes that you're adjusting now that you know what you actually have on the first day for 18 of your year 5, or if you're at a 21 cohort, your year 2 budget. So again, kind of snapshot in time day, the first day of your current budget period is one way to look at those 3 columns there.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right.
Do we have any questions, or should we?
I don't see any questions in the chat. Like I said, if you think of questions, even as we're going through the rest of the talking circle today, pop those over in the chat. Otherwise, we'll keep going. And then you can always ask questions later as well. So really important, you have a budget revision due. So remember, you can do budget revisions as many times throughout the year as you need. If you need to do another budget revision in May, if you need to do another one in August, those are fine, but you always have one due at the beginning of your grant year, because that's setting up your budget. Like Angela said, we had our snapshot of the first day when that money magically arrived to us, and now we're setting it up the way we need it. So for fiscal year 18 grantees, your budget revision is due November 17th. And for fiscal year 21 grantees, yours is due October 13th. Okay. So a little bit sooner time frame for those fiscal year 21 grantees. So I know you'll be working on that really quickly. And again, remember, reach out with those questions. That is what we're here for. We really do want to provide all the help we can with that, so that you don't spend time feeling frustrated with your budget. So November 17th, October 13th, I will be sending out calendar reminders for this. I got feedback last year that was helpful to get calendar reminders for those. If you don't want that calendar reminder though, just decline it. It doesn't hurt my feelings. If you don't want that on your calendar, decline it. It's also a great time for me to plug that it's the start of a new grant year. You may have some new members of your team. While Angela, as your program officer, is only able to directly communicate with your project director, we as the TA team are able to communicate with your full team. And that's also how we make our distribution list for these talking circles, for other information that we send out through the year, for the newsletter. So if you'd like to add any of your other team members onto that email list, now is the time. You're welcome to pop it in the chat or to shoot us an email. We just need their name, their role, and their email address, and we can add as many folks from your team as you would like. So feel free to, like I said, pop it in the chat or shoot us an email and get that updated, because I will be sending out all the new year calendar reminders for talking circles and other deadlines. And so you'll want to make sure that you can have everybody on that. All right, let's go to our next piece. Now we're going to actually break down your budget. So we're going to kind of walk category by category through your budget, not only in what that looks like, but also in some kind of common tips and tricks for those. So your first step before you start doing your budget revision should be to look at your grant award notification, your GAN. Your project director can pull that down out of G5. And it's really important that that's your first step, because you want to make sure that the award you got this year is the award you think you got this year. And what I mean by that is, just because in your proposal or in your year 1 GAN, it said that that's what you were getting this year, sometimes there are some changes. There may have been some slight cuts, and you want to make sure that you're working with correct budget numbers. So you will go down and you'll look at block 7 for authorized funding, and you want to look at what it says for this action and for budget period. It's really going to be important to check that number, because that's how much you were awarded for this year. And that's what you should be working off of for your existing grant budget plus your carryover. Next slide. All right. And one other thing of note, just before we hop into this, as I'm thinking about it, is also, when you're thinking about your carryover, please remember that your carryover is based on G5. I know you may have other expenditures locally, but that carryover that should be in your budget revision is how much money was remaining in G5 as you started this year. Okay. All right, now let's hop into budget categories. So your standard budget categories are personnel, fringe, travel. We don't typically use equipment on these budgets. Remember, that would be items over $5,000, really large dollar items. We do use supplies, contractual, other, indirect expenses, and training stipends. Okay, and we'll kind of talk about each of these one by one. With personnel, all project staff that are paid through payroll, including your part-time staff or those that you may split across different funding sources, should be included in personnel. Those are typically people like your project director, your program coordinator, if you have maybe an administrative assistant. You may have someone who is a mentor coordinator or induction coordinator, all of those different personnel roles. And you'll want to make sure and denote in that row what amount of time they're spending on this project. So are they spending a full amount of their time, 100%? So they're 1 FTE? Are they only spending half their time? Or maybe they're spending half their time on your 21 grant and half their time on your 18 grant. But that means that they're 0.5 FTE for this particular budget and 0.5 FTE for the other budget. So make sure to include that denotation in there. And then, yeah, check with your payroll department how extra duty pay is handled. So you may be paying, say, someone who already has a full-time job and you're paying them in addition to that. So you'll want to know, is that something that you're going to pay through personnel, or do you have to maybe contract with them? That'll be important to kind of look at. And then the budget in your proposal likely used an average salary estimation for various staff roles. Once you've hired them, that may be very different. They may be paid more or less than you were estimating. And so you'll want to update your budget with that, because you may have some cost savings that you can recover and move to another line item, or you may need to pull some money from another area to be able to cover their salary and their fringe. So really look at the budget implications once you actually fill those roles. And then just a little example of what that would look like. So in this example, the program coordinator actually was being increased. So they put additional money in that budget change area and a little narrative explanation that they're increasing that FTE from part-time to full-time. Now, fringe is one that is always tricky. So these are your employer paid payroll expenses, such as workers' compensation, health insurance, Social Security, Medicare. And the reason it's typically tricky is it depends on what people elect into. So somebody may decide, I don't want the employer insurance. I get my insurance through my spouse, or I don't want insurance in general. And that changes how much you end up having to pay into fringe. They may not elect into certain retirement accounts and things. And so it can be a little tricky, but I typically have found that if you reach out to HR, they have a general percentage that they'll tell you to use for estimation. It's better to estimate a little high here than a little low, because better to get toward the end of the year and realize, oh, I have some money I can recover and move somewhere else, than to realize I only used 5%. And oh no, everybody elected into insurance and I'm going to have to try to magically find money somewhere. So, you know, talk to your HR and get that percentage that they kind of use for estimation. And then, like I said, aim a little high rather than a little low.
Sarah, just going to add one quick note there. I've had a few of you, and it wouldn't surprise me over the life of your respective grants, particularly our 21 cohort, to hear from you that there's been an increase, right, in salary and fringe that maybe wasn't reflected in your original projections. Those increases, because they're mandated, their policy by your institutions or organizations, are perfectly fine to request. And I think that the example that Sarah's probably going to go into will help you kind of think about that, about those increases, and just ensuring that you're pulling out, you're not only adding where you might need to add, but wherever you take funds from the direct cost line categories, that you're explaining what is not going to get compromised, right? Or maybe that you just have extra funds, for example, available in supplies, just to make that up for a moment. And so you have those funds and you're going to move them over to personnel and fringe. So just noting that because I know a number of folks have had some increases recently.
Well, and the other thing I'll kind of give a heads up that often happens is a lot of times when your grant was written, nobody factored in that anyone would ever get a raise or that insurance would ever get more expensive. And in reality, hopefully everybody's getting a raise every year, even if it's teeny tiny, hopefully it's something. And often our insurance goes up every year. But a lot of times it's just not accounted for in your existing grant budget. So you want to make sure that you, living in the real world, account for that in your budget revisions. All right, let's go to our next category. So travel. Travel expenses for approved grant expenses are things like airfare, including like the baggage fees that you might have to pay, hotel, meals and incidentals, the registration fee for a conference or training, mileage if you're having to go out to schools for recruitment, or maybe you're going out for induction activities, you know, that type of mileage can be included. But you do need to follow GSA's per diem rates or your organization's policy. So you may have organizational policy in place, and that's fine as well. You are required to allocate funds for the project director meeting each year. However, I can give you the official answer that this year's PD meeting is going to be virtual. So any monies that you had originally intended to allocate there, you can move that cost savings somewhere else. So hopefully that gives you a nice little cushion to move somewhere else in your budget this year. And at our next talking circle, we'll be sending out some save the dates for that project director meeting as well. So just a little plug for that we're going to give you lots of heads up this year. Some other potential travel expenses that come up are, you know, do you typically attend conferences or certain training things throughout the year? Like I said, the mileage, if you're traveling to program sites or to certain program activities, just remember to kind of think about those and make sure that you're accounting for those in there. And then we've gotten multiple requests over the years for international travel to conferences. And I'm sure that they are wonderful conferences full of great information, but it's probably not going to be an allowable expense. And it's something that you always would have to ask for prior approval of. I know of a grantee who did go to an international conference, just assuming that that would be a-okay. And then they got to find a way to magically cover those expenses locally because it was not okay. And it was not an approvable expense. And you don't want to be caught in that situation where you're having to try to find other ways to cover those expenses. So better to ask about any of those additional travel pieces and put them in your budget revision for approval in advance. I think, Angela, you're going to hop in on this one.
Yes. So I wanted to talk a little bit, and this is really more for our FY18 cohort, but certainly our newer grantees, I would say just take some notes on this because it'll matter for you more in the future. You know, you do a lot of travel support for your participants, and sometimes it's appropriate to think about that travel as being under training costs, and sometimes it's appropriate to think about it under direct cost. So I wanted to walk through, especially as more and more people are thinking through induction services, how to be thinking about where that cost should be applied. So I'm going to start actually with something that's probably more relevant to the 21 cohort. And I've had a couple of conversations about these type of activities, and I'm going to just kind of broach it today. And I hope those of you on the phone or on the Zoom will think about this because, you know, I think many of you seasoned folks are getting really creative, which I like to see, about ways to maximize the benefits for your participants and really helping them have some flexibility with respect to what they're going to be held to. So let me tell you what I mean. The pre-training activity. Sometimes I know as you guys are recruiting and you haven't yet matriculated in a participant, let's say it's now, and you know that you won't matriculate them until maybe January into the actual program. But you need to get them reeled in now. You need to start the ball rolling and get them incentivized and get them prepared so that they're in a state of readiness to matriculate on time and implement and begin the program, begin the actual official training. Translation, you're not going to put them in the DCS, in the data collection system, until January. But you know that as part of that recruitment process and you know, maintaining their enthusiasm and planning to be in the program, they might need a little bit of a nudge and a little bit of incentive to do that. So a couple of examples of these activities might be that the participant travels to a workshop that you're holding on native language in advance of the training program, or the participant travels to the campus to complete enrollment in actual grant project participation administrative tasks. So I know there've been a number of you that say, we're going to bring everybody in all at once. We're going to do it all together, all in one room, and get it done in real time. And that's worked for some of you, depending on your situations. And one thing I would say about the costs, and in this case, travel associated with those things, I would implore you to consider that a direct cost as opposed to a training cost. And there are a couple of reasons why we would not consider it a training cost. One is because maybe they're going to this native language workshop that you're making available as sort of a preview to their training is not a requirement for the degree, right? Because everything we consider a training cost is part contributing to a degree requirement. However, the other thing to consider, which I think is really more important, is I know there have been situations where you guys have sort of this captive audience, and you might do things, for example, like send textbooks in advance of their actual matriculation. You enter them in the DCS, you apply that textbook or this travel, you know, cost as a service payback obligation cost in the DCS, and then it turns out they don't matriculate at all. And they never actually start the program. So when that happens, and we see in the DCS a $500, you know, outstanding service payback for somebody who never even started the program, I cringe, because we don't want to put any individual in that position of owing the federal government for something they didn't actually end up doing. And so if you consider this a direct cost, we don't have to do that. They're not going to go, that cost is not going to go into that service payback category because it's not a requirement of the degree. So if that's the case for some of you, as I know you guys, some of you have struggled with the recruitment and achieving your targets, think carefully about what would be prudent. So again, just what's reasonable, right? And everything I've heard so far, things like, I'm going to give them some books in advance, or we're going to have a workshop, or we want to be able to bring them. And I want to caution, you're not offering to pay for travel because you're interested in recruiting somebody. This is somebody who has told you, yes, they've given you at minimum a verbal commitment, or maybe even filled out the paperwork. But again, we always tell you, don't put in that paperwork until they've actually matriculated, because you don't want to have them be accountable for something they don't actually begin. So I just throw that out there as an option, as a think about. And if you'd like to talk about how that might work for you or want to suggest some things, feel free to give me a call and we can have those conversations. But I do appreciate, again, the ingenuity out there, because I think this is really important. And I know that it takes a lot more than just handing out an application to get people sometimes to come into the door for you guys. So whatever we can do to help facilitate that, I want to make sure that happens. So other direct costs, as far as travel category, of course, it's your travel whenever at some point you do come in person to DC or wherever for a project director's meeting. So I know in some applications, not all, In some applications, some of you have proposed and approved applications. You guys have proposed to bring participants to certain regional conferences or wherever, various conferences that might be relevant to their training. You have some discretion about one, to think about is there going to that conference a requirement in order to earn their degree? So that's the first thing. If it's not, then it's really at your discretion to determine whether it's a requirement that you have for their project, for their being part of this project, a participant in this training program, grant funded training program. If not, if it's something that's optional, again, I would implore you to consider that optional travel direct cost and not something that they are obligated to pay back. And it might be situational, and you'll have to determine what that line is. You don't want us to determine that. You guys should determine what that is. And again, equity, right? Wherever you apply, however you apply that. And then post-training activities. So I've had a lot of these questions from our final year, our year 5 grantees for FY18 cohort. Ask about various induction activities. Can we do this? Can we do that? You should be doing whatever activities will help to support not only the placement, but the retention of your participants in the job that they have found, in the qualifying job that they have found. We've had a lot of people ask about the supports for things, and I'm just using this easy example of praxis boot camps. Absolutely. Pay for that, pay for them to go. I've had some conversations here internally and just confirmed the approval. And I just want to make sure everybody knows that when you do things for participants who you have exited from the program, and let's say it's a cohort of maybe 12 participants that just finished up in May 22, and you're asking them to be a part of a praxis boot camp, even though they're now teaching, there might be a test or exam, and I'm saying praxis, but whatever your teacher certification exams may be in your respective states. That I know this doesn't apply to everybody, so I apologize. But whatever those exam preps are, and helping them to pass those so that they can have full certification, that's completely allowable. It's also completely allowable, let's say, that you want to offer it on Friday at 3 p.m., which is after they're out of school. It is completely appropriate to offer them a per diem in order to attend that induction. A lot of times we've heard from folks increasingly that incentivizing that, i.e. paying people to attend that, is certainly one way to make sure that they attend and they participate and they benefit from the induction services you're providing, and that is appropriate. So I'll go back to Sarah's earlier reference to GSA per diem or whatever per diem policy your organization or institution requires. That is allowable. Again, equity, right? Even offering dependent care for that day, some kind of payment for dependent care. Again, I would just tell you, calculate based on what you might allow for dependent cost allowance accordingly. And just as a reminder, the standard per child is $300 of dependent care stipend per month. That's what we allow. That's our maximum. You can allow whatever you want. You can allow $25 if that's what you have in your budget. You can, whatever is appropriate for the length of time that you're offering that particular induction activity. If it's a 1 day or a 2 day or whatever it is. But I just want to encourage you to be thinking FY18 grantees, especially since many of you have lots of funds there left. Yes, you may pull it from training costs. So if you have funds that are still remaining in carryover from unused training funds that you know you will not use for anybody left, this is one of those pre-approvals. Can I move those training funds over to direct cost in order to provide this type of direct service delivery or supports for direct service delivery to these individuals? Yes, you may. So again, just be sure to ask pre-approval, and you can put those things in your budget and make those proposals as far as proposed budget changes and moving costs out of training. So I will almost always pre-approve training costs moving into the direct cost category if it's direct service supports to your participants who've completed and exited, and it's an induction service activity. Yes, Nancy. I've had this question a lot, and yes, again, can we offer to pay for the praxis exam if they participate in a boot camp as a direct cost? Yes, you may. Again, this is one of those, if you have it already in your direct, if you have funds available in your direct cost categories, great. If you don't, but you have it in your training costs, you can ask for pre-approval to move it into direct cost in order to apply that. Because of course, just as a reminder, if a participant has completed, they're no longer accruing any kind of training payback, right? So any training obligations. Nancy, I'll just say again, if you're going to offer to pay for an exam for one participant, you have to be prepared to know that you have a budget to pay for all of them if somebody comes and asks for that. So that's always the rub, right? Of just being mindful in budgeting for those things and making sure that if you needed to offer to all, or that you should offer to all, and that you should be prepared to pay for all of whatever it is you're offering and have the budget to do it. Okay. And then versus again, the training costs, degree requirement, participant travel to offsite and symposium required for degree attainment. I would consider that a training cost. Grant project requirement. So this is again, the difference, right? So if some of you impose your own specific requirements as part of their participation, meaning as part of receiving this training benefit, apart from what the department requires. If you've put that, for example, in their, application, whatever they sign off, their assurances to you, and it's a requirement, then it is a service payback obligation cost. It's a training cost. But if you haven't, and it's something optional you're presenting, I would encourage you to think about, again, moving it into the direct cost. Licensure, I think that's more, again, it depends. I don't know what those, when we talk about licensure, I think that means different costs to different people in different states. So I'll just say, Carmelita, that's a case-by-case basis. And I would be asking and be prepared to provide that detail if that's what you're proposing. Okay.
And there was
I know.
one clarification question asking about moving the training to direct before using for induction services. Sorry, what was the question? The clarification? They were verifying that they need to move the training funds to direct before using them for induction services.
They need pre-approval to do that, meaning in your budget revision, you can note it in your changes in your column, right? In your budget changes column, you would put, I'm moving minus whatever that amount is from your training cost line or training stipends line to, I'm just going to say travel. We'll say it's an issue of giving them travel money to get to your required boot camp, I'll say, for induction. And you're moving $30,000 into travel. Well, then that budget revision explanation, you're saying, I'm requesting to move training stipend funds to travel in order to provide induction service, yada, 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 right? That's your justification. That's your narrative there and your explanation for why you're asking. That's your pre-approval ask. Does that make sense? Is that helpful, Sarah?
I think that clarified it. I'll let you know if I get a message that it wasn't, but I think we're there.
Okay. But yeah, in this particular budget revision template, sorry, Sarah, this is your pre-approval ask. So when I say pre-approval, you're asking the question, you're making the request in this budget revision. And if it's something you need to do sooner, you don't need to wait for those due dates. If you have it already, great. but maybe it's just that item or that issue and you need to deal with it now, again, communicate with me, send me an email asking me for that. And then when I say yes, you're just incorporating that into your revised budget request that you'll submit later.
Great.
Okay. Thank you, Sarah.
Yeah. All right, so let's look at equipment versus supplies. I mentioned earlier, we really don't use equipment for this particular grant, but should that come up, this way you kind of understand what would pop it over into that equipment category, and therefore you would want to reach out. So anything that's going to be over $5,000 per unit, so per item, then that's automatically going to make it equipment. It's automatically going to need prior approval because it's such a large purchase and often has to be capitalized. And so some examples would be like if you decide, oh, we need to buy a copy machine. That's typically, any copy machine I've seen, going to be over 5,000. So that's automatically going to go into equipment. What might be more common is that your department is going to buy a copy machine. And as we talked about earlier, things that are allocable, if you're sharing that across a number of different programs, then you may have the expense for a portion of that copy machine and that usage. Same thing with things like maybe a smart board, different things like that, that honestly just don't come up that often with this particular grant program. Now, what does come up are supplies. That's things that are less than $5,000 per unit. And they don't require specific approval per item, but you will still be putting that into your budget revision, typically by category. So like you don't have to have a row for a stapler and a row for a printer and a row. Unnecessary. You can have office supplies that'll cover your paper clips and your pens and your markers and your paper, all of that stuff under office supplies. That doesn't have to be delineated out line by line. You will want to delineate out though those larger items. So if you are buying some laptops, you might say 3 laptops for, the project director, the program coordinator, and the induction coordinator, whatever that might be. Those things you would make in different rows. So think about what your categories are there. But remember that, yeah, we don't need it so specific that it's like box of markers. Don't go that far. As well as this is where you might put printing expenses for materials for marketing and things. So like if you're paying a printer to print up a bunch of flyers or brochures, things like that, totally fine, do that. That's under supplies. I will sometimes see people put that under other. We really want to limit the use of other because that really is a supply. All of those printing expenses would be a supply. So really think about, and we'll talk about under other, some things that might actually be under other, but by and large, we want to really put those things under the other categories. All right, let's go to our next. And you'll see what it would look like if we were putting in some additional supplies. Then you'll sometimes see a construction category. We don't even put that on your budget revision form because it's not an allowable expense. You will not be building anything with your PD grant funds. Oh, and I see postage. Yes. Yeah. And you can even, if postage is a big part of your expenses, you could have a line item for that. So yeah, so since you're sending out a lot of things, just put a line item under supplies for postage. And that's great. Next category is going to be contracts. Many of you have things in your contractual category. This is typically external organizations or individuals with whom you have an agreement that they're going to provide a certain service for a certain fee. You need to follow your organization's contract policies. OIE doesn't have specific contract policies as far as what contract template you have to use or anything like that. You should follow your organization's policies for that. Note that most of your organizations are not going to allow you to contract with current employees. So typically that's going to be through like extra duty and things like that, not through a contract. You want to ensure that you do have, though, a current signed agreement with all your contractors. And that is potentially something that could be asked for in an audit, is that you do have contracts in place with the people you have under contractual. And just a little note there, you'll see little bullet for best practice is to have a clause stipulating how the contract can be terminated. So if for some reason they're not performing up to standards, then you want to be able to get out of that. So let's look at our example there. So you'll see we've got a little example here. If maybe you decided that you were going to spend a bit more, or maybe you put in, a lot of times in your proposal, it was put in based on just an idea of how much you might be paying a certain contractor. And then when you actually go to do that, then you may have found that, oh, we went out for bid. It ended up being a little less expensive or a little more expensive than what we anticipated. So again, account for that, move those monies around where you need to. Now we get to that other category. So you'll notice again, we're saying limit the use of this category to only those expenses that absolutely don't fit into the standard categories. Some of the expenses that we sometimes will see here, a lot of supply expenses for some reason down in other. If it's something you're purchasing, if it's an item, it's almost always going to be under supplies. Postage, printing, all of that supplies. We'll also see often mileage down here in other, that should be under travel, or expenses for training and professional development, like the conference registration fees or a training registration fee. That should be under travel. Another one that we'll see there are sometimes stipends to people who are maybe doing a training for you, stipends to maybe an elder, stipends to an existing employee. Those are almost always going to be handled under either personnel or contractual.
Sarah, I'll add one more thing here. On stipends, I also tend to see which is appropriate if you have, for example, stipends to your mentors who might be in the schools where your folks are placed. That's perfectly appropriate there. What I also see in other, which I think to Sarah's point, should really be broken down. And I'm going to just keep picking on the boot camp example. If you have like a summer session or a boot camp kind of session, I often see that listed and then a big dollar amount. And really it should be broken down to be clear about what might be a supply related cost in that around that session versus any travel for people versus a stipend or contracted payment to a consultant who might be delivering some of your, professional development services during that event. So just make sure you're breaking those down and putting them in the appropriate categories. Thanks, Sarah.
All right, so let's look at our other example. So you'll see here, it was facility rental fees. So that was something appropriate for other, and they had to actually take it down. It was not as expensive. And then we'll move into direct versus indirect. So direct costs are those that can be identified specifically with a particular cost objective, such as a grant, contract, project, function, or activity. Basically, all those things that we're putting in those other categories of your budget. Your indirect costs are those that have been incurred for common or joint purposes. So a lot of times that's the expense of maybe the rental of the building you're in that is split amongst all the different programs within your organization. It might be the electricity cost for your office or custodial services. It's if you're using your HR department, you're not paying the full salary of all those HR individuals, but you are chipping in toward that. It's all of those things that go into running your entire organization, but that aren't directly just expenses of your program. They're going to be typically split across all the different things your organization does. So an indirect rate ensures that each federal agency providing funding picks up its fair share of that indirect cost. And your training grant has an 8% maximum allowed. So your typical indirect rate for your organization might be, say, 23%, but it's capped at 8% maximum for your PD grant. And you can see this 2 CFR 200.412 to 415 for more information, as well as in your GAN attachment 4. A little bit more on indirect. You do need to provide, Angela, with an indirect cost rate agreement for your organization, and it has to be up to date. So a lot of times the dilemma comes in that sometimes these get expired and not updated as frequently as they should. This is an agreement that's signed by a federal agency and an authorized representative of the non-federal entity. So your indirect cost rate is going to be typically determined by whichever federal agency you get the majority of your grant funds as an organization from. So you may have that from the Department of Ed, or it may be through a different federal entity. Typically, if you talk to your budget office, they're going to be able to tell you what your indirect cost rate is and provide you with that indirect cost rate agreement that you can then just forward on to Angela. Okay? But really important to keep an eye on when that expires. Maybe put a calendar reminder about a month out from when it expires to start reaching out to your budget office and reminding them, hey, I need a copy of our new indirect cost rate agreement. Because if your agreement is expired, you cannot claim indirect cost. So really important to always be keeping that up to date. If you have any questions, you can always reach out to the Indirect Cost Division here at the Department of Ed. So we've got their email up there. Andre Hilton is the director of that division, and you've got his phone number as well. He is great as far as answering any questions you might have about how indirect works. If you need to renew your rate, any of that, he's your go-to person and definitely more knowledgeable about indirect than even any of us. Let's go to our next. So there are some changes that have to be pre-approved. And we talked about a few of them earlier. Things like changing your scope or objectives of your project, of course. If there's going to be changes in key personnel, which is always your project director and could be some others of your staff, depending upon what you put in your proposal. Project engagement. And what that means is how much time those personnel are going to be spending on your project, your participant support costs, your sub-awards, which I don't think many of you have sub-awards, and cost sharing or match, which again, really isn't for the most part applicable. So we have a, and I think this is where I flip over to you, Angela.
Okay, sure. So we talked about expenditures that must be pre-approved, and certainly a number of circumstances that Sarah just raised a minute ago. Cooperative agreements, grant agreements, changes to the training costs for sure. And I'll give you an example, particularly to our year 2 FY21 grantees, of changes to training costs that tend to unexpectedly happen. It's not uncommon for me to hear from some of you, a couple of years in, that maybe in a particular fiscal year, your state or some other entity in your area has provided unexpected funding for your participants, meaning maybe they're covering the tuition instead of what you proposed. And sometimes that can run into a lot more money that suddenly becomes available. So when that happens, I definitely urge you to get in touch with me and let's talk about what those implications are. And especially the earlier you do that, the better. Don't wait and just say, oh yeah, 2 years ago we got this, so that's why we have all this money left, because the money will just get cut. Versus us having a conversation early on to be able to say, hey, maybe we think about support using these funds and shifting funds to future induction services that can be more robust and that can do a lot more than what we, scale up what we had originally intended to do. And that would be allowable. So just to consider that. Anything that you might do that generates program income, the revision of budget and program plans. So to the extent you need to change significantly, original objectives that are approved in your application, or there are other major budget revisions, i.e. greater than 10% of the entire budget. And when we say entire, meaning all 5 years. If it's more than 10% of all 5 years cumulative total of your budget, then yes, we need to talk. Any other there that are going to pop up, Sarah? Yes, membership, subscriptions, and professional activity costs. Typically, those won't be approved unless you put them in your original approved application. And then, of course, any unique travel costs that come up again that aren't originally covered, we would ask for pre-approval. We've talked about these common no expenses, and this is consistent with uniform guidance. So incentives or awards are not allowed, promotional materials. I'm going to come back to meals for program participants and international travel that Sarah talked about earlier. Next slide. So I've shared this language with a couple of you before, or a few of you at this point, about meals and meetings. And, Sarah might remember, I like to call this the case of the $16 muffin. And by that, I mean that a number of years ago at the department, we ended up on the cover of the Washington Post because there was a meeting where, when a journalist went and looked up the costs of meals in a hotel that we used to host a meeting, a single muffin was charged, they were charging us $16 for that muffin. And so when we talk about being good stewards of federal funds, part of this means being prudent, right? And back to that reasonable, allowable, allocable conversation. And so, of course, that made the pendulum swing into a much stricter interpretation of when and how and why we would allow federal grant funds to be used for food, beverages, or snacks. I think the good news, frankly, for you all is the short answer is most of you are in places where, if you're hosting, for example, your participants for a training, for an event, for a summer boot camp, whatever it is, the likelihood of you hosting that someplace where there are 10 eateries immediately outside your meeting space is highly unlikely. So the need to provide those meals in order to keep your captive audience and to be able to provide the full set of services that you intend, then yes, you can do that. So there is a justification associated with that. It's not a justification that I'm asking you to send to me, but I would encourage you to have a memo on file of, here's our agenda, here's why we have, where it's a working lunch, or we have a guest speaker at this time talking on this topic relevant to the content that we're covering today. Those are the types of unique circumstances that would allow for you to use funds for meals. And of course, again, I think consistent with your respective per diem costs is reasonable. But that's the type of documentation that might also be helpful, is to be clear about what's happening during that lunchtime or breakfast time, whatever that is. Typically, I would say it's lunch that you're providing. And if you have questions about that, there's more guidance. And in a fax document that we have available on ed.gov, and the link is right there. Alani, I'll just ask you to share that link. Thank you. But for the most part, I don't ever really see this as problematic when you guys have asked to offer that. So reasonableness is just what I ask you to practice there. Common yes expenses. So again, Sarah's given you a lot of examples in the budget revision template. You know, you're moving things around from supplies typically, or travel that doesn't get used, or, you know, remaining personnel costs. You know, if you know that you're going to be able to apply it to something else in the current year, move those things. Don't wait till the end of the year, meaning the end of this project year. When you don't move these things around to where you intend, and you wait till the end of the project year, that means when I'm looking at the APR and I'm looking at your budget in April, I'm going to assume that you just have all of this carryover, right? Projected carryover in a category, unless you have moved it to where you intend to move it. And I would likely reduce funds in that case. And again, moving funds between budget or even within budget categories, all of that is reasonable. Next slide. I'm just sharing here a couple of links, and we go to the next slide. There are different trainings. Some of you have grant conditions in place where we asked that the new project director named complete those trainings. Those are really important, not because I expect you to memorize it, but just to get your feet wet and get a basic understanding that will help to inform your budget formulation. I think that's all I have here, Sarah, unless there's anything more you want to add on those topics.
No, I'll just let everyone know over in the chat that we did post the budget revision form. And then I also posted, I know we talked earlier about the G5 view only access. I went ahead and posted that form that you need to request that, so that you don't have to go and request the form from G5. You can just have that form, go ahead and get it filled out and sent in. So that's over in the chat for you to download, and I'll also send it out via email. We do have a couple of questions. So how about a service internal to our university that wouldn't need a contract like printing? That would go under supplies. And then if on their GAN, if their indirect cost area shows in unrestricted, does that mean that they could actually have a higher indirect cost rate, or do they still have to follow the 8% cap?
The 8% is specific to the type of grant that this program is. It's specifically a training grant. So the 8% does apply.
Perfect. So that's for everybody.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, that is all the questions we have in the chat. But if any of you have other questions, feel free to pop those over there or unmute and ask. And we'll go over a few just wrap up pieces here that Olani is going to share with you.
Yeah, so I'm gonna excuse me, launch our end of event poll. You should be seeing that pop up on your screen. If you could just take a couple seconds, let me know that you can see it. If you can't, and please, we really use this information to inform our planning for these talking circles and for other events as well. So it's really helpful. Your input is very helpful. Okay. I just want to sort of mark your calendars. Again, the next PD circle will be on October 20th. You will be getting that invite if we haven't sent that out yet. As well as, don't forget, our monthly office hours will be in October, will be on the 27th. It's every fourth Thursday of each month, and the time still remains the same. We want to thank you for your time. If you have any questions, again, you can always reach out to the OIE Technical Assistance Team, and definitely be in communication, as we've heard all the way through today's talking circle, with Angela as it relates to your budget revision and any questions you may have there as well. Thank you for your time. If there's any, let's see, we're 5 minutes early. If there's any questions, you can go ahead and come off mute. If not, please make sure you finish the end of event poll and have a wonderful, wonderful weekend.
And thanks to those of you who posed questions. Feel free to send them after as well if you have them. Thank you, everybody. Have a good week.